I'm Edward. Are you counting the days to the winter holidays, New Year and Christmas, or do you prefer the easy warmth of summertime? Tell us below, and don't forget to subscribe so our cozy community can keep growing. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Foxglove End before noon. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived in Foxglove End with that particular quality of stillness that precedes industry. Miss Marple, who'd been invited to take tea with her old acquaintance Mrs. Edith Finch, found herself arriving rather earlier than intended, the bus from St. Mary Mead having made unexpectedly good time despite the season. Foxglove End was not, strictly speaking, an end at all, but rather a short lane of perhaps 6 houses that branched off the main road and concluded, somewhat anticlimactically, at a high hedge bordering farmland. The houses themselves were modest but respectable, the sort of dwellings that suggested retired persons of limited means who nonetheless maintained standards. Miss Marple, walking slowly up the lane with her shopping bag and umbrella, observed that each front garden displayed the same variety of winter jasmine, and that the doorsteps had all been scrubbed that morning. There was, she noted, a great deal of activity for 10:30 on Christmas Eve. A woman of perhaps 50, wearing a sensible tweed coat over a rather too bright floral dress, emerged from the second house carrying a large biscuit tin. She walked briskly past Miss Marple without acknowledgement, her expression suggesting the preoccupation of one engaged in important duties. From the house nearest the road came the sound of voices, one of them raised in what might have been either instruction or complaint. Miss Marple could not quite distinguish the words, but the tone was familiar. It reminded her of Mrs. Beddoes at St. Mary Mead, who organised the church flower rota and believed that volume was the natural companion of authority. Mrs. Finch appeared at her door before Miss Marple could knock. "Oh, my dear Jane, you are prompt. Do come in, though I must warn you we are all at 6s and 7s this morning. The charity collection, you know. It happens every year, and every year one would think we had never attempted such a thing before." She was a small, neat woman with grey hair arranged in careful waves and the sort of face that suggested a lifetime of mild disappointments borne with good humour. Miss Marple had known her slightly in their youth, and they had renewed their acquaintance through the sort of occasional correspondence that maintains friendships without demanding much of them. The hallway was narrow and smelled of furniture polish and something else, something slightly medicinal that Miss Marple could not immediately place. Mrs. Finch led her into a sitting room, where a small fire burned cheerfully, and a tea tray waited on a low table. "The annual collection for the elderly," Mrs. Finch continued, settling herself into a chair with a small sigh. "We all contribute what we can, and then it is distributed to those in the village who have less. A modest tradition, but a kind one. Or it would be, if we could manage it without quite so much fuss." "Surely," Miss Marple said gently, pouring tea with steady hands. "Charitable work is always somewhat fussier than one anticipates. I have found that when people work together for a common good, there is often the difficulty of deciding exactly how that good should be achieved." "You have it exactly." Mrs. Finch accepted her cup with visible relief. "There are 6 households in the lane, you see, and we each take on different tasks, or rather we are each supposed to take on different tasks. What actually happens is that 3 of us do most of the work, 2 do very little while making a great show of being involved, and 1 does nothing whatsoever." Miss Marple smiled. "Rather like the committee for the church bazaar at home." "Just so. Mrs. Bowen, who lives at number 4, considers herself the organiser of the whole business, though in truth she does more organising than actual doing, if you understand me. She is the one you likely heard as you came up the lane, a voice that carries." "I did notice," Miss Marple murmured. "Then there is Miss Hartwell at number 1, just by the road. She bakes, which is generous of her, though she does tend to mention it rather frequently. Mr. and Mrs. Pettigrew at number 3 are elderly and contribute financially, which is their part and a fair one. The Armstrongs at number 5 are rarely home, but they always leave a donation and some tinned goods, and Mr. Reeves at number 6 does whatever is left undone." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Mr. Reeves?" "Colin Reeves, a quiet man, a widower of some years. He's the sort of person one relies upon without quite noticing one is doing so. This year, for instance, he has taken on the collection of the late donations and the counting of the funds. No one else wished to do it, you see. It means being available on Christmas Eve, when everyone else wants to attend to their own preparations." Through the window, Miss Marple could see a man crossing the small patch of green space that separated the houses on one side of the lane from those on the other. He was of medium height, thin rather than spare, and walked with the careful gait of someone who had learned to move quietly through life. He carried a ledger under one arm and wore an expression of patient resignation. "That is Mr. Reeves now," Mrs. Finch said. "Going to check the donation board in the utility room, I expect. We maintain a shared space, you see, in a sort of extended shed behind number 4, Mrs. Bowen's house. It has a notice board where we post the list of contributors and what they have given. Mr. Reeves keeps the accounts." "A position of trust," Miss Marple observed. "Yes, I suppose it is, though I cannot imagine anyone more trustworthy than Colin Reeves. He was a bank clerk before he retired, which I suppose gives him a natural aptitude for such things. Very correct, very precise." The door of Mrs. Finch's house opened without a knock, and the woman in the tweed coat whom Miss Marple had passed earlier entered with the confidence of long familiarity. "Edith, I have brought the tins for sorting. Where shall I put them?" "Oh?" She stopped, seeing Miss Marple. "I did not realize you had company." "Mrs. Bowen, may I introduce my friend Miss Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead. Jane, this is Mrs. Clarice Bowen." Mrs. Bowen was handsome in a sharp-featured way, with dark hair only lightly touched by grey, and a manner that suggested efficiency verging on impatience. She set down the biscuit tin with rather more force than necessary. "How do you do? Edith, I really must insist that you look over the donor list when you have a moment. There are some discrepancies." "Discrepancies?" Mrs. Finch's voice held a note of anxiety. "Small ones, nothing to concern ourselves with, I am sure. But Mr. Reeves mentioned this morning that some of the amounts seem inconsistent with previous years. He is quite fussy about such things." Miss Marple, who had been observing Mrs. Bowen with the quiet attention she might give to an unusual specimen of plant, said mildly, "I suppose accuracy is important in charitable matters. One would not wish there to be any confusion." Mrs. Bowen turned to her with an expression that suggested she was reassessing her initial dismissal of this elderly visitor. "Indeed not, though I think Mr. Reeves sometimes forgets that this is a neighbourhood effort, not professional audit. We all do our best." "I am sure you do," Miss Marple said. "In St. Mary Mead I have found that the more informal an arrangement, the more important it is that someone maintains a proper record. Otherwise one can never quite account for what has happened." There was a brief silence. Mrs. Bowen's expression had stiffened slightly. "Quite yes," she said. "Well, Edith, I must get on. There is still a great deal to be done." She departed with the same briskness with which she had arrived. Mrs. Finch let out a small breath. "Clarice means well, but she does tend to take over. I sometimes think she believes the entire lane would collapse without her supervision." "And Mr. Reeves?" Miss Marple asked. "Does he mind being supervised?" "I doubt he notices. He simply does what needs doing and asks nothing in return, not even thanks, which is fortunate, as he rarely receives any." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "There was a man in St. Mary Mead rather like that. Albert Griggs. He took care of the churchyard for years, never missing a week, never complaining. When he died, it emerged that he had been using the key to the church to sleep in the vestry on cold nights. No one had ever troubled to ask if he had adequate lodging. How dreadful." "Yes," Miss Marple said, softly. "We had all been so accustomed to his reliability that we forgot he was a person who might have needs of his own. It is the danger, I think, of depending upon someone who never asks for help." Mrs. Finch looked troubled. "You do not think—" "I think nothing at all, my dear. I'm merely an old woman who notices that the same patterns appear in different places. But tell me, this utility room where the donations are kept, is it locked?" "Oh no, we all have access. There seemed no need for locks among neighbours." "Of course not," Miss Marple said. "Though I have noticed that the absence of locks can sometimes create its own difficulties. When anyone can enter, it becomes rather hard to remember who actually did." From somewhere outside came the sound of footsteps on gravel, and then a door closing. Miss Marple glanced toward the window. The lane appeared quiet now, the morning's activity having subsided into whatever private preparations occupied each household. "More tea?" Mrs. Finch asked. "Thank you, yes." Miss Marple held out her cup. "And perhaps you might tell me a little more about this charity collection. I find such traditions fascinating. The way communities organise themselves reveals so much about their character." Mrs. Finch, thus encouraged, began to speak, and Miss Marple, her eyes kind but extraordinarily observant behind her spectacles, listened with the particular quality of attention that had, over the years, proven rather unfortunate for those who mistook courtesy for innocence. Outside, Foxglove End continued its preparations for Christmas, each household busy with its own concerns, each person confident that someone else would notice if anything went wrong. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a dangerous sort of confidence indeed. Chapter 2. The Volunteer. No one thanked. The matter of Colin Reeves came up again an hour later, though not in any way that suggested his importance to what would follow. Miss Marple had been shown the small garden at the rear of Mrs. Finch's house, which was kept with the same modest precision as the front. A narrow path led between winter vegetables toward what Mrs. Finch had described as the shared utility room, a structure that had apparently begun life as a garden shed and been expanded over the years into something approaching a small outbuilding. "It is convenient for storing the donation boxes," Mrs. Finch explained, leading the way along the path. "And for the notice board, of course. We find it helpful to have a central location where we can all check what needs doing." The utility room proved to be larger than Miss Marple had anticipated, perhaps 12 feet square, with a concrete floor and walls lined with shelving. The door stood open, and inside she could see various boxes and bags arranged with some attempt at organisation. A paraffin heater in one corner provided minimal warmth. The notice board Mrs. Finch had mentioned occupied most of one wall, covered with lists, notices, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn calendar marking the various tasks associated with the charity collection. Mr. Reeves was there, standing before the board with his ledger open in his hands. He glanced up as they entered, his expression neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, but simply accepting of their presence. "Mrs. Finch," he said, with a small nod. "I hope I am not in your way. I wanted to check the donor list against my accounts." "Not at all, Mr. Reeves. May I introduce my friend Miss Marple, who is visiting from St. Mary Mead." "How do you do?" Mr. Reeves closed the ledger carefully and tucked it under his arm. He was, Miss Marple thought, somewhere in his late 50s or early 60s, with grey hair that had receded from a high forehead and hands that bore the slight tremor of someone who spent much of their time indoors. His clothes were clean but worn, his collar frayed at the edges, in a way that suggested either economy or simple indifference to appearance. "I understand you are managing the accounts for the collection," Miss Marple said. "That must require considerable care." "It is not complicated," he replied, though without any suggestion of false modesty. "People give what they can, and I record it. The difficulty lies only in ensuring that everyone who wishes to contribute has the opportunity to do so." Mrs. Finch moved toward the shelving, examining the various boxes with apparent interest. "Have the late donations begun arriving?" "A few. Mrs. Hartwell brought hers this morning, though she had marked her name on the earlier list as well. An error, I am sure, and the Armstrongs left an envelope before they departed for their daughter's house." He paused, glancing at the notice board. "There are still several names unaccounted for. Miss." Marple approached the board, studying it with the careful attention of someone examining a flower arrangement for the church. The donor list was written in a neat hand, though several names had been crossed out and rewritten, in what appeared to be different ink. Some entries had small notations beside them, amounts, she supposed, or perhaps reminders about particular items donated. "You maintain very careful records," she observed. "Someone must." There was no resentment in his tone, merely statement of fact. "In my experience, Miss Marple, charitable efforts suffer most not from lack of generosity, but from lack of organisation. People give willingly, but if their contributions are not properly acknowledged and accounted for, suspicion arises, and suspicion once rooted is difficult to remove." Very true. Miss Marple thought of the incident in St Mary Mead involving the missionary fund, where a simple failure to record a donation had led to weeks of unpleasantness. "I suppose, then, that your role is rather important to maintaining harmony in the lane." For the first time, something that might have been humour touched Mr Reeves's expression. "I should not go so far as that. I merely ensure that the numbers agree with one another. Harmony, I have found, depends less on accurate accounting than on people's willingness to overlook what they would prefer not to see." It was an interesting remark, Miss Marple thought. Before she could respond, however, a voice called from outside, "Colin, are you in there? I need you to look at something." Mrs Bowen appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless, carrying a wooden box that appeared to strain her arms. She set it down with evident relief. "This is far heavier than it should be," she announced. "The Pettigrew's donation, supposedly, but I cannot imagine what they have put in it. You had better check the contents against their note." Mr Reeves bent to examine the box, which was perhaps 18 inches square and bound with rough twine. A card attached to the top read in elderly handwriting, "From E. and H. Pettigrew for the collection. God bless." "It is certainly heavy," he agreed, attempting to lift it. The box shifted only slightly. "Have you opened it?" "Of course not. That is your responsibility." Mrs Bowen brushed dust from her coat with sharp movements. "I am merely delivering what was left on their doorstep, though I must say it seems inconsiderate to make such a burden of charity. We are none of us young." Miss Marple, watching this exchange, noted that Mr Reeves made no comment on Mrs Bowen's age, though she appeared considerably more robust than he did. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "I shall inventory it this afternoon." "See that you do, and Colin, we must discuss the donor list. There are inconsistencies I cannot account for." "I am aware of them." "Are you?" Mrs Bowen's tone sharpened. "Then perhaps you might have mentioned them to me. I am, after all, coordinating this effort." "I had intended to raise the matter after Christmas," Mr Reeves said quietly. "There seemed no need to cause concern during the holiday." For a moment the two regarded each other in silence. Then Mrs Bowen said, rather stiffly, "Very well, but we shall discuss it, Colin. These things cannot simply be left unresolved." She departed with the same abruptness that seemed characteristic of her. Mrs Finch, who had been examining a collection of tinned goods with great concentration during this exchange, let out a small sigh. "Clarice does become rather intense about the collection." "Does she?" Miss Marple asked. "I had the impression that Mr Reeves was the one maintaining the actual records." "Oh, he is. But Clarice considers herself the public face of the effort, if you'll understand me. She likes people to know that she is involved in charitable work. Colin simply does the work." Mr Reeves had returned to his examination of the notice board, apparently unbothered by this characterization. Miss Marple moved to stand beside him, her eyes travelling over the various lists and notations. "You are a bank clerk, I understand," she said conversationally, "for 32 years. Then you must have developed quite an eye for details that do not quite align." He glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something approaching interest in his expression. "One does learn to notice patterns, and departures from patterns. Have you noticed such departures in the charity accounts?" There was a pause. Mr Reeves set down his ledger and carefully adjusted his spectacles. "Miss Marple, I have learned over the years that there are two types of irregularities in financial matters. There are errors which are common and usually innocent, and there are discrepancies which are less common and rarely innocent, The difficulty lies in determining which one is observing. And in this case, Co, he said slowly, I am not yet certain. There are amounts that do not correspond to previous year's donations from the same households. There are names on the list that were added and then crossed out. And there are, he hesitated, there are small sums that I cannot quite account for. Have you mentioned this to anyone besides Mrs. Bowen? No, as I said, I had intended to wait until after Christmas. These are my neighbours, after all. One does not wish to make accusations without being certain of one's facts. Miss Marple nodded slowly. In St. Mary Mead we had a treasurer for the Women's Institute who took a similar view. She noticed that the accounts did not balance, but said nothing, hoping the matter would resolve itself. Unfortunately, by the time she finally spoke, a considerable sum had gone missing. And was it recovered? No, Miss Marple said gently. The person responsible had used it to pay medical bills for a sick relative. By the time the truth emerged, there was nothing left to recover. The treasurer felt terribly guilty for having waited, though of course the fault lay elsewhere. Mr. Reeves was silent for a moment. Then he said, You're suggesting I should not delay. I am suggesting, Miss Marple replied, that silence, while often kind, can also be dangerous, both for oneself and for others. Mrs. Finch had moved to the doorway, gazing out at the lane. We should return to the house. It is getting rather cold, and I'm sure Mr. Reeves has much to do. They left him there, standing before the notice board with his ledger in hand, a solitary figure in a cold room full of other people's generosity. As they walked back along the path, Miss Marple found herself thinking of Albert Griggs again, the reliable man who had died alone because no one had thought to ask if he needed help. Mr. Reeves lives by himself, she asked. Yes, since his wife passed some 7 years ago. He manages well enough, I think, though one worries. He's the sort of person who would never admit to difficulty. And he has taken on this accounting work every year. For the past 5 years, yes. Before that, Mrs. Bowen's late husband handled it, but after Harold died, Colin volunteered. No one else wanted the task, you see. It is tedious work, and it means being available when others wish to be with their families. They had reached the house. Mrs. Finch held the door open, and Miss Marple passed through into the warmth of the hallway. In my experience, Miss Marple said, settling herself back into her chair by the fire, the people who volunteer for thankless tasks often have their own reasons for doing so. Sometimes it is simple kindness, sometimes it is a desire for occupation, and sometimes, she paused, accepting the fresh cup of tea Mrs. Finch offered, sometimes it is because they wish to keep watch over something they consider important. You think Colin is watching for something? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Mr. Reeves is a careful man who notices when things do not align, and I think that in a small community such as this, where everyone depends upon everyone else's discretion, such noticing can become uncomfortable for those who prefer not to be noticed. Mrs. Finch looked troubled. You make it sound rather ominous. Not at all, my dear. I am simply observing that Mr. Reeves has placed himself in a position of some responsibility, and in my experience responsibility often brings with it certain difficulties, particularly when one is dealing with other people's affairs. Through the window, Miss Marple could see Mr. Reeves emerging from the utility room, the heavy wooden box in his arms. He walked slowly, his steps careful toward his own house at the end of the lane. Even from this distance she could see the strain the weight placed upon him. Something is not right, she murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Finch. I beg your pardon? The box, Miss Marple said. Mr. Reeves remarked that it was heavier than expected. I wonder what the Pettigrews have donated that weighs so very much. Tinned goods, I should imagine. Or perhaps books. They are great readers. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. But she continued to watch as Mr. Reeves disappeared into his house, and her expression remained thoughtful. In Foxglove End, the preparations for Christmas continued, but beneath the surface of neighbourly cooperation, Miss Marple had detected something else, something that reminded her of the countless small villages she had known, where kindness and calculation lived side by side, and where the most dangerous secrets were often hidden in plain view, protected by the simple assumption that no one would look too closely at what everyone already knew. Chapter 3. The list pinned to the board. It was just past noon when Miss Marple found herself returning to the utility room, though not entirely by design. Mrs. Finch had been called to the telephone, a neighbour requiring immediate advice about a troublesome oven, and Miss Marple, left to her own devices, had expressed a mild interest in seeing the winter garden more thoroughly. It was the sort of innocent request that no hostess could refuse, and Mrs. Finch, distracted by the crisis of an uncooperative roast, had waved her toward the back door with scarcely a thought. The garden path was quiet in the pale December light. Miss Marple walked slowly, her umbrella serving more as a walking stick than protection against weather. The utility room door stood ajar as it had earlier, and she paused at the threshold. The room was empty now, though the paraffin heater still burned, giving off its characteristic smell of warmth and slight petroleum. The donation boxes had been rearranged somewhat, and the heavy wooden box from the Pettigrews now sat in a corner, its twine still intact. Miss Marple stepped inside, drawn by the notice board that occupied the far wall. In St. Mary Mead she had learned that much could be discerned from the notices people posted, and the manner in which they maintained shared records. A tidy board suggested organisation or perhaps anxiety about appearances. A chaotic board suggested either genuine disorder or a surfeit of enthusiastic contributors. This board was neither tidy nor chaotic, but rather something in between, a surface that had been maintained with care but had accumulated complexity over time. The donor list occupied the centre position, a sheet of lined paper pinned at all four corners. Miss Marple drew closer, adjusting her spectacles. The handwriting began neatly at the top, in what was clearly a feminine hand, round letters carefully formed, with a slight rightward slant. The first entries read Mass. Miss E. Hartwell, baked goods, tins. Mr. and Mrs. E. Pettigrew, monetary donation. Mrs. E. Finch, preserves woolens. Below these, however, the writing changed. The letters became smaller, more cramped, and the slant shifted slightly. Several names had been added and then crossed out with single lines, not the heavy scoring one might use to indicate complete removal, but rather the light strike of someone marking a correction. Mrs. C. Bowen appeared 3 times on the list, each instance in different ink and different handwriting. The first entry in the round feminine hand listed her contribution as organisation and coordination. The second in the cramped hand had added monetary supplement. The third, squeezed into the margin in what Miss Marple recognised as Mr. Reeves's Prowl script, read simply amended per discussion. It was the sort of document that told several stories at once. Miss Marple leaned closer, studying the crossed-out entries. One appeared to be a name she could just make out before the crossing obscured it. Another showed a sum of money, perhaps £5, that had been struck through and replaced with a smaller figure. The door behind her creaked, and she turned to find Mr. Reeves standing in the entrance, a small notebook in his hand. Miss Marple, he did not seem surprised to find her there. I had thought you were taking tea with Mrs. Finch. She was called to the telephone. I hope you do not mind my curiosity. I've always found community organisation fascinating. Have you? He entered the room and moved to stand beside her, following her gaze to the notice board. Most people find it tedious. Perhaps because they do not observe carefully enough. A list such as this, for instance, tells one a great deal about how people work together, or fail to. Mr. Wolves was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You have noticed the corrections." One could hardly avoid noticing them. The handwriting changes several times across the page. Yes. He opened his notebook, comparing it to the list on the board. The original list was written by Miss Hartwell, who has the neatest hand. She recorded the initial commitments from each household. Then Mrs. Bowen made additions, and I have made further amendments as actual donations arrived. And the crossed-out entries. He hesitated, his finger tracing one of the struck-through lines. Errors, mostly. Miss Hartwell recorded some donations twice, once as promised and once as received. Mrs. Bowen added her own name in a manner that suggested a larger financial contribution than was actually made, and I have been attempting to reconcile what was promised with what was delivered. A difficult task. More difficult than it should be. His voice was quiet, but held a note of something that might have been frustration. In a proper accounting, Miss Marple, one should be able to trace each contribution from promise to receipt to distribution. Here, however, the path is not clear. Miss Marple nodded slowly. In St. Mary Mead, we once had a similar difficulty with the Church Restoration Fund. Money was donated, recorded, and yet somehow the final sum did not match what had been promised. It emerged that our treasurer had been recording pledges as received donations, creating the impression of greater support than actually existed. And the purpose of this deception? Pride, Miss Marple said simply. She wished the village to believe that the restoration was fully funded. When it became clear it was not, she found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to explain the discrepancy. Mr. Reeves studied the board in silence. Then he reached up and unpinned the list, holding it carefully by its edges. "May I show you something?" He carried the paper to the window where the light was better, and Miss Marple followed. In the clearer illumination, she could see what had been less obvious before. Beneath some of the crossed-out entries, the original writing was still faintly visible. "Here," Mr. Reeves said, pointing to one such correction. "This originally read Mrs. C. Bowen, £10. It has been changed to £5, and the change is in Mrs. Bowen's own hand. She reduced her own contribution, or corrected an optimistic initial pledge. But the interesting point, Miss Marple, is that the original sum of £10 appears later in the accounts as having been received from an anonymous donor." "I see." "Do you?" He looked at her directly, and she saw in his eyes something she had seen before in a people who carried uncomfortable knowledge. "I am not certain that I do. I have tried to give the matter innocent interpretation. Perhaps Mrs. Bowen pledged £10, found herself able to give only £5, and then made up the difference anonymously to avoid embarrassment. It is the sort of thing a proud person might do. But you do not believe that is what happened?" "I believe," he said carefully, "that the accounts for this year's collection do not balance with previous years in several respects. I believe that money has been moved from one category to another in ways that are difficult to trace, and I believe that when I attempted to discuss this with Mrs. Bowen this morning, she became defensive in a manner that suggested guilt rather than confusion." Miss Marple accepted the list from him and studied it once more. The paper showed signs of having been handled frequently, its edges slightly worn, some of the writing smudged where fingers had touched it. "How long have you suspected irregularities?" "Since last year, though I could not be certain. This year, however, the pattern is clearer. Small amounts, never enough to cause immediate alarm, but consistent enough to suggest intent rather than error." "And you have kept this knowledge to yourself?" "I had no proof," he said. "Only suspicions. And in a community such as this, suspicion without proof can be more destructive than the original offence. I had hoped that by waiting, by watching, I might understand what was truly happening. But now, Mr. Reeves said quietly, I find I can wait no longer. The collection will be distributed on Boxing Day. If there are irregularities in the accounts, they must be addressed before then. I cannot, in good conscience, allow questionable funds to be given to those in need." He took the list back from her and returned it to the notice board, pinning it carefully in its original position. His hands, Miss Marple noted, trembled slightly, though whether from cold age or emotion she could not determine. "You mentioned that you intended to raise this matter with Mrs. Bowen after Christmas," Miss Marple said. "I did mention that, yes, but circumstances have changed. The Pettigrew's donation, for instance, that heavy box I was asked to inventory. I have now examined its contents, and it contains not tinned goods or books, but rather a collection of old silver plate and some jewellery of modest value. Certainly nothing that would account for its weight. There is something else in that box, Miss Marple, packed beneath the visible items, something heavy enough to make the entire container difficult to lift. Have you looked beneath the visible items? Not yet. I wished first to understand why someone would pack a donation in such a manner. It suggests either that the Pettigrews are donating more than appears on the surface, or that someone else has added to their contribution without their knowledge. Miss Marple thought of the unlatched door she had noticed earlier, the ease with which anyone might enter this room unseen. She thought of Mrs. Bowen's sharp insistence that the box be inventoried, and of her defensive reaction to questions about the accounts. Mr. Reeves, she said gently, I think you should not delay in examining that box, and I think you should perhaps not do so alone. He looked at her with an expression that might have been gratitude, or simply acknowledgement of shared understanding. You believe there is danger in knowing too much? I believe, Miss Marple said, that in small communities, secrets have a way of protecting themselves, and those who threaten to expose them sometimes find themselves in difficulty. From somewhere across the lane came the sound of a door closing. Mr. Reeves glanced toward the window, then back at the notice board with its revealing list of corrections and amendments. I shall examine the box this afternoon, he said. After that I shall speak with Mrs. Bowen. Whatever the truth may be, it cannot remain hidden. Miss Marple nodded, though she felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the December cold. She had seen this pattern before in other villages, with other well-meaning people who believed that truth and justice must prevail. Sometimes they did, but sometimes the cost of their prevailing was higher than anyone anticipated. Chapter 4. The Box That Was Too Heavy. Miss Marple did not return immediately to Mrs. Finch's sitting room. Instead, she remained in the utility room after Mr. Reeves departed, ostensibly to examine the various boxes of donations with the innocent interest of an elderly lady concerned with charitable works. In truth, she was thinking, the heavy box from the Pettigrew sat in its corner, unremarkable save for its weight. Miss Marple approached it slowly, her eyes taking in the details that Mr. Reeves, in his concern with accounting, might have overlooked. The twine that bound it was new, the knot tied with the sort of competence that suggested familiarity with parcels. The card attached to the top was written in a shaky hand, elderly as Mrs. Finch had said, but the handwriting was clear enough. From E. and H. Pettigrew for the collection, God bless, she did not attempt to lift the box. At her age, such efforts were both undignified and unwise, but she did bend, carefully, supporting herself with her umbrella, to examine its base. The wood was old but sound, and there were scrape marks on the floor around it, as though it had been moved or repositioned recently. Are you quite well, Miss Marple? She straightened to find Mrs. Finch in the doorway, her expression concerned. Perfectly well. Thank you. I was merely admiring the generosity of your neighbours. This box, for instance, the Pettigrews must have contributed quite substantially. Mrs. Finch came forward, glancing at the box without particular interest. Oh, Edward and Helen always give what they can, though I must say it does seem rather excessive to make such a heavy parcel. One would think they might have divided it into smaller, more manageable portions. Unless, Miss Marple suggested gently, they were unaware of its final weight. It is possible, is it not, that they packed what they intended, and someone else added to it afterward? Added to it? But why would anyone do such a thing? That, Miss Marple said, is indeed the question. They were interrupted by a commotion from outside, voices raised in what sounded like disagreement. Mrs. Finch hurried to the door, and Miss Marple followed at her own pace. In the small green space between the houses, Mr. Reeves stood facing Mrs. Bowen. Between them, on the ground, sat the heavy box, apparently in the process of being transported. I told you I would inventory it this afternoon, Mr. Reeves was saying, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining patience. There was no need for you to move it. I was merely trying to help, Mrs. Bowen replied, though her tone suggested offence rather than helpfulness. The box was in the way. and I thought to bring it to your house to save you the trouble. I did not expect you to take it as interference." "I take it as interference because it is interference, Clarice. The donations are my responsibility until they are properly recorded and distributed. Moving items without consulting me makes that task more difficult." Mrs. Bowen's face had flushed. "Your responsibility? I think you forget, Colin, that this collection is a community effort. You may keep the accounts, but that does not give you ownership of the process." "I have never claimed ownership. I have merely requested that the process be allowed to follow its proper course." Miss Marple, watching from the doorway of the utility room, noted several things. First, that Mr. Reeves appeared genuinely distressed by the box's movement, beyond what simple annoyance would warrant. Second, that Mrs. Bowen's defensiveness seemed excessive for such a minor disagreement. And third, that the box now sat at an angle slightly different from how it had been positioned in the utility room, as though it had been turned or tilted during transport. Mrs. Finch moved forward, her hands fluttering in the manner of someone attempting to smooth troubled waters. "I am sure there has been a simple misunderstanding. Clarice, perhaps if you explained what you intended—" "I intended to be helpful," Mrs. Bowen said sharply, "though clearly that is not appreciated." She turned and walked away with rigid dignity, leaving Mr. Reeves standing beside the box with an expression of profound weariness. Mrs. Finch sighed. "Oh dear, Christmas does bring out such tensions, does it not?" Mr. Reeves bent and attempted to lift the box. It rose perhaps 6 inches from the ground before he was forced to set it down again, breathing heavily. "Mr. Reeves," Miss Marple said, approaching, "might I suggest you open the box here before attempting to move it further? If something inside has shifted, it would be wise to know what you are dealing with." He looked at her, and she saw the struggle in his expression, the desire to maintain proper procedure warring with practical necessity. "You're right, of course." He drew out a pocket knife and began cutting the twine. "Though I confess I am curious what could weigh so much. The Pettigrews are not wealthy people. Their donations are always modest but sincere." The twine fell away. Mr. Reeves lifted the lid of the box, and Miss Marple moved closer to observe its contents. The top layer, as he had mentioned earlier, consisted of silver plate items, several serving spoons, a small tray, a sugar bowl with its lid missing. Beneath these lay a velvet bag that proved to contain costume jewellery, the sort of pieces elderly ladies accumulate over a lifetime and rarely wear. Mr. Reeves removed these items carefully, setting them on the ground beside the box. Beneath the jewellery, packed with some care, was a layer of books. Mr. Reeves lifted one out. A Bible, well worn, with the Pettigrew's name inscribed on the flyleaf. "They have given their family Bible," Miss Finch murmured. "How generous, and sad in a way." But Mr. Reeves was frowning. These books alone would not account for the weight. There must be something beneath them. He removed the remaining volumes, 3 in total, and then paused. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in brown paper, was something roughly rectangular in shape and considerably denser than books. Mr. Reeves lifted it out with some effort. The paper crinkled as he set it on the ground, and Miss Marple heard the unmistakable sound of metal shifting within. "That is not from the Pettigrews," Mrs. Finch said with certainty. "They would never wrap a donation in such rough paper. Helen is very particular about presentation." Mr. Reeves cut the string holding the paper in place and carefully unwrapped it. Inside were approximately 24 tins of food, soup, vegetables, condensed milk, of the sort one might purchase at any grocer's. They were new, their labels bright and unscratched, and they had been packed with considerable weight efficiency. "Someone has added these to the Pettigrew's donation," Miss Marple observed. "Added them after the box was initially packed and tied." "But why?" Mrs. Finch asked. "If someone wished to donate tinned goods, why not simply bring them openly?" Mr. Reeves was examining the tins with a peculiar intensity, turning them over in his hands as though looking for some identifying mark. Finally, he said, "These are expensive brands, not the sort one typically donates to charity, where quantity is usually preferred over quality." Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, they were donated by someone who could afford quality but wished to remain anonymous. Or, Mr. Reeves said slowly, by someone who wished to dispose of goods that might otherwise raise questions about their origin. The three of them regarded the tins in silence. Miss Marple thought of the donor list with its corrections and amendments, of Mrs. Bowen's defensive reactions, of the unlatched door that allowed quiet access to the utility room. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "when you mentioned that the accounts did not balance, did the discrepancy involve money that appeared to be missing or money that appeared unexpectedly?" He looked at her sharply. "Both, in different years. Last year there was slightly less than expected. This year there is slightly more, as though someone were attempting to correct a previous shortage." "By adding goods rather than money?" "It would be easier to add goods anonymously. Money must be recorded. Goods can simply appear among other donations." Mrs. Finch had grown pale. "You're suggesting that someone has been taking from the collection in previous years and is now attempting to repay what was taken?" "I am suggesting nothing," Mr. Reeves said firmly. "I am merely observing facts. These tins were added to the Pettigrew's donation without their knowledge. The person who added them wished to remain unidentified, and the timing coincides with irregularities in the accounts." Miss Marple bent to examine the wrapping paper more closely. It was coarse brown paper of the sort used for general parcelling, without any distinctive characteristics. But there was something else, a faint scent that she recognised from earlier in the day, though she could not immediately place its source. "This paper has been stored somewhere with a particular smell," she said. "Something medicinal, perhaps, or chemical." Mr. Reeves sniffed the paper and nodded. "Camphor, or mothballs, the sort of thing used to protect stored linens." "Mrs. Bowen keeps her linens in the utility room," Mrs. Finch said, then stopped, her hand going to her mouth. "Oh, but that does not necessarily mean—" "It means nothing," Mr. Reeves agreed. "Many people use camphor, and the utility room is accessible to everyone in the lane." But his expression had grown grimmer. He began repacking the box, first the tins and their paper, then the books, then the silver plate and jewellery. When he had finished, he retied the twine with careful precision. "I shall need to speak with the Pettigrews," he said. "They should know that their donation has been altered, and I shall need to speak with Mrs. Bowen. If she is replacing funds she took in previous years, she must understand that the matter cannot simply be resolved through anonymous restitution." "And if she denies any involvement?" Miss Marple asked. "Then I shall have a very difficult decision to make." He lifted the box with visible strain and began carrying it toward his house. "But something is not right here, Miss Marple. Something is very much not right." They watched him go, his steps slow and careful under the weight of his burden. Mrs. Finch turned to Miss Marple with troubled eyes. "You do not think Clarice would actually steal from charity?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that people do surprising things when they are desperate or proud or simply unable to admit they have made a mistake. The question is not whether Mrs. Bowen is capable of such an act, but whether she had reason to commit it. What reason could possibly justify stealing from those in need?" Miss Marple thought of the dozen cases she had known in St. Mary Mead, of the respectable people who had taken small sums to cover private emergencies, always intending to repay, always finding the repayment more difficult than the original theft. "Justification," she said, "is often found more easily than one might expect. It is consequence that proves more elusive." Above them the December sky had begun to darken, though it was barely past 2 o'clock. In Foxglove End lights were beginning to appear in windows, warm against the gathering dusk. It should have been a scene of comfort and anticipation, a Christmas Eve settling into its gentle rituals. But Miss Marple, watching Mr. Reeves disappear into his house with his heavy burden of questions and doubt, felt only the familiar chill of trouble unfolding in a place where everyone believed themselves safe. Chapter 5. The door left unlatched. The discovery came quite by accident, as such discoveries often do. Miss Marple had been invited to take a brief rest before the late afternoon. Mrs. Finch was concerned that her guest might be overtiring herself, and had been shown to a small bedroom at the rear of the house. She had no particular intention of sleeping, but she understood that her hostess needed time to attend to various domestic preparations, and it seemed churlish to refuse the kindness. The bedroom window overlooked the back garden, and beyond it the utility room. Miss Marple arranged herself in the chair by the window with her knitting. She had brought a simple project, knowing that idle hands would make her a tiresome guest, and allowed her gaze to rest on the scene below. It was perhaps 3:30, that peculiar hour of winter afternoons when daylight seems to surrender prematurely to dusk. The utility room was visible as a darker shape against the general greyness, its single window showing no light. Miss Marple's hands moved with the automatic precision of long practice, the needles clicking softly, but her attention was not on the knitting. The utility room, she had observed, had 2 doors. The main entrance faced the green space between the houses, the door through which she and Mrs. Finch had entered that morning. But there was a second door at the rear, which she had noticed earlier, but not remarked upon. It opened, she assumed, onto the lane that ran behind the properties, providing access for deliveries or the removal of garden waste. As she watched, that rear door moved. It was a small movement, barely perceptible in the fading light. But Miss Marple's eyes, trained by years of observation, caught it immediately. The door had swung open perhaps 6 inches, then closed again, as though someone had tested whether it was latched, or as though a breeze had caught it. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose, moving to the window for a clearer view. The door remained closed now, but she had not imagined that movement. Someone had either just entered or just left the utility room, using the rear entrance that was invisible from most of the houses in the lane. She glanced at the small clock on the bedside table. Mrs. Finch would be occupied with preparations for another quarter hour at least. There was time, if one moved with purpose. The back stairs of Mrs. Finch's house led directly to the garden door. Miss Marple descended them with the careful speed of someone who knew that haste was often less efficient than steady progress. Within 2 minutes she was crossing the garden path, her umbrella in hand, her expression one of mild interest rather than urgent investigation. The utility room's main door stood open, as it had all day, but when Miss Marple entered, she found the space empty. The donation boxes sat in their places, undisturbed. The notice board bore its lists and notices, unchanged from earlier. The paraffin heater continued its quiet burning. She moved through the room toward the rear door, which was indeed unlatched. The latch itself was a simple mechanism, the sort that could be opened from either side with minimal effort. Miss Marple examined it closely, then pushed the door open and looked out. The lane behind the properties was narrow and unpaved, little more than a cart track that provided access to back gardens. It was empty now, showing no signs of recent passage. But the ground was soft from recent rain, and Miss Marple could see in the fading light the clear impression of footprints leading away from the utility room door. They were not large footprints, nor particularly small. They were, in fact, unremarkable, the sort of prints that dozens of people might make, wearing the sensible shoes favoured by residents of modest means in winter weather. But they were fresh, and they led not toward any of the back gardens but away, down the lane toward the main road. Miss Marple returned to the utility room and closed the rear door, testing the latch. It held firm when properly engaged, but she noticed that the catch was worn, the metal smoothed by long use. A firm pull would open it even when latched, and a careless closing would leave it unsecured. "Miss Marple?" She turned to find Mr. Reeves standing in the main doorway, a ledger under his arm and an expression of mild surprise on his face. "Mr. Reeves, I was just examining the rear door. It appears to have been left unlatched." He came forward, setting his ledger on one of the shelves. "It is often unlatched. The mechanism is faulty, and we have all learned simply to push it closed without bothering with the latch itself. Is something wrong?" I observed someone using this door a few minutes ago. Or rather, I observed the door moving, which suggests someone either entered or departed. Mr. Reeves glanced toward the rear entrance, his expression troubled. You are certain? Done. Quite certain. The movement was deliberate, not the result of wind. He moved to the door and examined it as she came, then looked out at the lane beyond. When he turned back, his face had grown graver. This door provides access without being seen from any of the houses. If someone wished to enter the utility room privately to add or remove donations, for instance, or to alter the notice board, they could do so through this entrance with little fear of observation. Unless, Miss Marple said gently, someone happened to be watching from an upper window. Did you see who it was? No, I saw only the movement of the door. By the time I reached the garden, whoever had been here had gone. Mr. Reeves returned to the main room and stood before the notice board, studying it with the intensity of someone searching for changes in a familiar landscape. After a long moment, he pointed to the donor list. This has been altered since I last examined it. Here, Mrs. Bowen's entry. The notation about the monetary supplement has been crossed out. Miss Marple joined him at the board. The change was subtle, a single line drawn through the words monetary supplement in ink that was slightly fresher than the surrounding notations. The crossing had been done carefully, without the anger of obliteration, but rather with the precision of correction. Mrs. Bowen's handwriting? She asked. I cannot say with certainty. The stroke is too brief to show much character. But it was done recently, within the past hour I would judge, given the ink's appearance. And the purpose of such a change? Mr. Reeves was silent for a moment. Then he said, to remove evidence of a promise that was not kept, or perhaps to remove evidence of a promise that was kept in an irregular manner. He moved to the corner where the Pettigrew's box had sat earlier, now removed to his own house. The floor showed a faint outline in dust where the box had rested, and surrounding it were those same scrape marks Miss Marple had noticed before. This box was moved at least twice beyond Mrs. Bowen's attempt this afternoon, he said, crouching to examine the marks more closely. Once to add the tins, I suspect, and once perhaps to verify they had been added successfully. You believe Mrs. Bowen has been using the rear door to access the utility room without observation? I believe someone has. Whether it is Mrs. Bowen or another resident, I cannot say. He straightened, brushing dust from his hands. But the pattern suggests a person familiar with the routines of the lane, someone who knows when the utility room is likely to be unoccupied, and who understands that the rear door provides unobserved access. Miss Marple thought of the various residents she had encountered that day. Mrs. Bowen, with her sharp efficiency and defensive reactions, Miss Hartwell, mentioned but not yet seen, who baked and kept the neatest hand, the Pettigrews, elderly and generous, the Armstrongs, rarely home, and Mrs. Finch herself, kind but perhaps too willing to avoid unpleasantness. Mr. Reeves, he said, when you spoke of examining the Pettigrew's box this afternoon and addressing the irregularities in the accounts, did you mention your intentions to anyone besides myself and Mrs. Finch? I mentioned them to Mrs. Bowen this morning when she pressed me about the discrepancies. I told her I could not discuss the matter until after Christmas, but that it would need to be addressed. And her reaction? She became defensive, as I mentioned earlier. She asked why I could not simply let the matter rest, why I had to be so particular about small sums. He paused. She used the phrase, no one would know the difference. An interesting choice of words. Yes, it suggested that the irregularities were deliberate but considered inconsequential, as though taking small amounts from a charity collection were merely a matter of accounting preference rather than a breach of trust. The light in the utility room had grown dimmer, the winter afternoon surrendering to evening. Mr. Reeves lit a second lamp from the one already burning, and the additional illumination cast new shadows across the notice board and its revealing list. I intend to speak with Mrs. Bowen this evening, he said, before Christmas Day arrives. Whatever has happened here must be resolved before the donations are distributed." Miss Marple regarded him with concern. "Mr. Reeves, if I may offer a word of caution, in my experience, confronting someone with evidence of wrongdoing, particularly in private, can be dangerous. People who have committed small wrongs often convince themselves that larger wrongs are justified to protect their secret." "You think Mrs. Bowen might be dangerous?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that desperate people are unpredictable. And I think that a person who has stolen from charity and is now attempting to cover that theft may become desperate if they believe their actions are about to be exposed." He nodded slowly. "I appreciate your concern, but I am not without resources, Miss Marple. I have handled difficult conversations before, and I believe that the truth, however uncomfortable, must be brought to light." It was the sort of statement that made Miss Marple's heart sink, for she had heard it before, always from well-meaning people who believed that virtue was its own protection. Sometimes they were proven right, but sometimes, in her experience, they learned too late that virtue was no match for fear. Then at least, she said, take care to meet with her in a location where others might hear if there is difficulty. Not in a kitchen with the door closed, not in a garden shed where one might be alone. "You are very kind to worry." He smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "But truly, Miss Marple, this is Foxglove End. We are neighbours. Whatever Clarice Bowen may have done, I cannot believe she would resort to violence to protect herself." Miss Marple said nothing, but she thought of the unlatched door, the careful corrections to the donor list, the anonymous tins hidden in another's donation. She thought of all the small, careful movements of someone who planned and calculated, who understood that secrets could be maintained through quiet action rather than confrontation. And she found herself profoundly uneasy about what the evening might bring. Chapter 6. A collection taken twice. Miss Marple was in Mrs. Finch's sitting room, pretending to read a magazine, when the knock came at the door just before 5 o'clock. Mrs. Finch answered it to find Miss Hartwell standing on the step, holding a covered basket and wearing an expression of considerable agitation. "Edith, I am sorry to disturb you, but I must ask whether you received a visit from the collection volunteers this morning. Before noon, I mean." Mrs. Finch looked puzzled. "No, I left my donations in the utility room yesterday evening. Why do you ask?" Miss Hartwell entered without waiting for invitation, setting her basket on the hall table with a sharp movement. She was a tall, thin woman of perhaps 60, dressed in a dark coat over a dress of unrelieved grey. Her face was lined in a manner that suggested habitual worry, and her hands moved constantly, smoothing her coat, adjusting her gloves, touching the edge of the basket. "Because," she said, her voice rising slightly, "someone came to my door this morning claiming to be collecting for the charity. A young person, I could not tell if it was a boy or girl, they were wearing a heavy scarf, with a collecting tin. I gave them £2, thinking it was part of our official effort, but now Clarice Bowen tells me there was no door-to-door collection planned for today, and she has no knowledge of any young volunteer." Miss Marple set down her magazine. "At what time did this occur?" Miss Hartwell turned to her, seeming to notice her presence for the first time. "I beg your pardon, I did not realise. This is my friend Miss Marple visiting from St. Mary Mead," Mrs. Finch supplied. "Jane, this is Miss Eleanor Hartwell from number 1. "How do you do?" Miss Marple said. "The time, if you can recall it?" "Just after 11, I think. I had finished my baking and was cleaning the kitchen when the knock came. The person said they were collecting late donations for the Christmas charity and showed me a tin that looked quite official. I did not question it." "Did you recognise this person?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No. As I said, they were bundled against the cold, and I have poor eyesight for distances. I saw only that they were young, or at least moved with a young person's quickness." She sat down heavily, her agitation giving way to something approaching distress. "I feel such a fool. I pride myself on being careful with money, and yet I simply handed over £2 to a stranger." Mrs. Finch had gone pale. "Eleanor, you do not think this was someone taking advantage of our charity effort to steal?" I do not know what to think. That is why I came to you. If no official collection was planned, then where did my £2 go?" Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the lane. The evening had drawn in fully now, and light shone from several of the houses. Everything appeared peaceful, ordinary, the very picture of a respectable neighbourhood preparing for Christmas. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "have you mentioned this visit to anyone else besides Mrs. Bowen?" "Oh, only to Clarice, as I said. I encountered her not 10 minutes ago, and she was quite adamant that no volunteers had been sent out. She seemed rather put out by the whole thing, actually, as though I had somehow inconvenienced her by being deceived." That, Miss Marple thought, was interesting. Mrs. Bowen's reaction suggested not concern for Miss Hartwell's loss, but irritation at the complication it introduced. "Did Mrs. Bowen seem surprised by your account?" she asked. "Surprised?" Miss Hartwell considered. "No, not particularly. Annoyed, yes, but not surprised. She simply said that I should have known better than to give money to anyone without verifying their credentials." Her mouth tightened, as though one expects to verify credentials when a neighbour's child comes collecting for charity on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Finch had moved to stand beside Miss Marple at the window. "But if someone is impersonating charity collectors, we must warn the others. The Pettigrews, certainly. They are elderly and might be easily confused." "The Pettigrews have already left for their daughter's house," Miss Hartwell said. "They departed yesterday evening. That is why they left their donation box, rather than waiting to hand it over personally." Miss Marple turned from the window. "Miss Hartwell, can you describe the collecting tin this person carried?" "It was metal, I think, dark blue or perhaps black, with a slot in the top. Not large, perhaps the size of a biscuit tin. They held it out to me, and I simply dropped the notes through the slot without really examining it." "And they said nothing beyond asking for donations?" "They thanked me. Said something about how generous the lane had been this year. Then they left, walking toward the main road." Mrs. Finch sank into her chair, her usual composure shaken. "This is dreadful, absolutely dreadful, to think that someone would prey upon our charity effort." But Miss Marple was thinking of something else. She was thinking of the donor list with its corrections and crossed-out entries. She was thinking of Mrs. Bowen's statement that some households had donated more than in previous years, while others had given less. And she was thinking of the pattern that had emerged across the morning. Donations added anonymously, accounts that did not balance, and now collections taken twice. "Mrs. Finch," she said, "you mentioned earlier that the lane was organised so that each household had different tasks. Who determined which households would be visited for donations?" "Clarice made a list. She has it in the utility room, I believe, showing which houses had committed to give and which needed to be reminded." "And would this list have been visible to anyone who entered the utility room?" "I suppose so. It was pinned to the notice board along with everything else." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I think we should speak with Mr. Reeves. He may have insights into whether other irregularities have occurred." "I shall go and fetch him," Mrs. Finch said, rising. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "it would be better if we all went together. This matter is growing more complex, and it would be wise to discuss it where the records are available for examination." They made their way to the utility room, Miss Hartwell still carrying her basket of what proved to be gingerbread, her contribution to the charity effort. The main door stood open, as it had all day, but the room was empty. "Colin is usually here at this hour," Mrs. Finch said, sounding uncertain. "Checking the donations before evening." Miss Marple approached the notice board. The donor list remained as it had been when she last examined it, but beside it was a new sheet of paper, written in Mr. Reeves's precise hand. It was headed, "Discrepancies Requiring Resolution," and listed several items. 1. Mrs. Bowen's monetary contribution, recorded as £10, reduced to £5. Anonymous, £5 received. 2. Miss Hartwell, 2 donations recorded, 1 in preserves verified, 1 monetary unverified. 3. The Armstrongs, donation received but household absent since still been. Anonymous tinned goods in Pettigrew's box. Value approx. £3. Origin unknown. 5. Total collected exceeds expected amount by £7.10. Miss Hartwell had come to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder. 2 donations from me, but I gave only the preserves yesterday evening, and the £2 this morning to that wretched impostor. And yet, Miss Marple said, Mr. Reeves has recorded a monetary donation from you. When did you give it? I did not give any monetary donation. Only the preserves, as I always do. I cannot afford to give money as well. Mrs. Finch looked stricken. Eleanor, if the accounts show you gave money, and you did not, then someone has recorded a false donation in your name. Or, Miss Marple said quietly, someone collected money from you twice. Once legitimately, which you do not recall, and once fraudulently this morning. The first collection would have been recorded, the second would not, as the collector had no intention of turning it over to the charity. The 3 women stood in silence, the implications settling over them like the December cold that seeped through the utility room's thin walls. Finally, Miss Hartwell said, You're suggesting that someone has been systematically stealing from the collection, taking money that was honestly given and recording it as anonymous donations or attributing it to households that never contributed. I am suggesting, Miss Marple said, that the pattern we are observing is consistent with embezzlement disguised as charitable confusion. Small amounts, carefully hidden among legitimate donations, extracted over time in a manner that would be difficult to trace. Mrs. Finch had pressed her hand to her mouth. But who would do such a thing? We are neighbours. We trust one another. Trust, Miss Marple observed, is often the embezzler's greatest ally. In St. Mary Mead we had a church secretary who took small sums from the collection for 3 years before anyone noticed. She was so trusted, so reliable, that it never occurred to anyone to verify her accounting. When the truth emerged, she claimed she had only borrowed the money, that she had always intended to return it. And had she? Miss Hartwell asked. She had returned some of it, yes, but only when she feared discovery. The original intent had been permanent theft, softened in her own mind by the story that it was merely a loan. From outside came the sound of footsteps on gravel. Mr. Reeves appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, carrying his ledger. Mrs. Finch, Miss Marple, Miss Hartwell, I'm glad to find you here. I've just returned from attempting to speak with Mrs. Bowen, and I... He stopped, seeing their expressions. What has happened? Miss Hartwell told him about the morning's visitor, and the £2 that had disappeared into a collecting tin. As she spoke, Mr. Reeves's face grew increasingly grave. When she finished, he set down his ledger and turned to the notice board, his finger tracing down the donor list. Miss Hartwell, you say you gave no monetary donation beyond what was taken from you this morning? None whatsoever. Then I fear we have a more serious problem than I suspected. He opened his ledger to a page marked with a slip of paper. According to my records, a monetary donation of £5 was left in the utility room 3 days ago with a note indicating it came from you. I recorded it in good faith, assuming you had simply contributed quietly without mentioning it. I left no such donation. Mr. Reeves closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, his expression held a weary resignation. Then someone has been fabricating donations, recording them in the accounts, and keeping the actual money. They create the appearance of generosity while stealing from those we are meant to help. But why fabricate donations at all? Mrs. Finch asked. Why not simply take money and record nothing? Because, Miss Marple said gently, that would reduce the total collected and draw immediate attention. By recording false donations that match stolen amounts, the thief maintains the appearance that the collection is proceeding normally. The accounts balance, or nearly so, and no one suspects that money has vanished. Mr. Reeves nodded. And when irregularities do appear, as they have this year, the thief attempts to cover them by adding anonymous donations of goods, which are harder to value precisely and easier to introduce without detection. Miss Hartwell had grown very still. You are describing someone who has planned this carefully, Someone who understands how the collection works and how to manipulate it. Yes, Mr. Reeves said. I am describing exactly that. Outside, in the gathering darkness of Christmas Eve, Foxglove End continued its preparations. But in the utility room, 4 people stood among the boxes and lists and careful records, understanding that beneath the surface of neighbourly charity, something far less charitable had been unfolding for quite some time. Chapter 7. The Kitchen Used Last. It was Miss Hartwell who suggested they should find Mrs. Bowen and confront her with what they had discovered. If Clarice has been taking from the collection, she must be made to account for it, she said, her voice sharp with indignation. The longer we delay, the more opportunity she has to conceal evidence or fabricate explanations. Mr. Reeves looked troubled. I agree that Mrs. Bowen must be questioned, but we should be careful not to make accusations we cannot prove. We have irregularities, yes, but we do not have certainty. We have a pattern, Miss Marple said quietly, and in my experience, patterns are often more revealing than individual facts. But Mr. Reeves is right. Confrontation without preparation can be dangerous. Dangerous? Miss Hartwell looked at her sharply. Surely you exaggerate. This is a matter of theft, not violence. Theft discovered, Miss Marple replied, can sometimes lead to desperate measures, particularly when the thief is someone whose reputation depends upon appearing respectable. But Miss Hartwell was already moving toward the door. I am going to number 4. Clarice Bowen owes me £2 at the very least, and an explanation for why money was collected in my name. You may come with me or not, as you choose. She departed with the same rigid determination that had characterized her arrival. Mrs. Finch looked helplessly at Miss Marple. Should we follow her? Eleanor can be quite forceful when she believes herself wronged. I think, Miss Marple said, that we should indeed follow. Mr. Reeves, perhaps you might bring your ledger. If there is to be a discussion of accounts, the records should be available. They left the utility room together. Mr. Reeves, curing the door behind them with unusual care. The evening had fully settled now, and the lane was dark except for the yellow rectangles of lighted windows. From somewhere came the sound of Christmas carols on a wireless, incongruously cheerful against the tension of the moment. They had not gone more than a few steps when they heard the raised voices. Miss Hartwell stood at the door of number 4, which Mrs. Bowen had apparently opened to her knock, but now seemed reluctant to open further. I am telling you, Eleanor, that I know nothing of any collection taken from you this morning. If you chose to give money to a stranger, that is hardly my responsibility. But it was done in the name of our charity effort. Someone used our collection as a cover for theft. Then perhaps you should be more careful about verifying credentials. I cannot be expected to supervise every transaction. Mr. Reeves stepped forward. Mrs. Bowen, I think we need to discuss the accounts. There are several matters that require clarification, and they cannot wait until after Christmas. Mrs. Bowen's feet, visible now in the light from her hallway, had gone very pale. This is hardly the time, Colin. It is Christmas Eve. Which is precisely why the time has come. The donations will be distributed on Boxing Day. Before that happens, I must understand where the money has come from and where it has gone. For a long moment, Mrs. Bowen stood frozen in her doorway. Then, with visible reluctance, she stepped back. Very well. Come in if you must. But I warn you, I will not tolerate unfounded accusations. They entered number 4, which proved to be arranged much like Mrs. Finch's house, but with more ornate furnishings and a faint smell of furniture polish overlaying something else. That same medicinal scent Miss Marple had noticed earlier at Mrs. Finch's. Camphor, she remembered, or mothballs. Mrs. Bowen led them not to the sitting room, but to the kitchen at the rear of the house. It was a practical choice, Mrs. Marple supposed. The kitchen table would provide space for examining the ledger, and the room was warm from the stove. But there was something about Mrs. Bowen's movements, the stiff set of her shoulders, that suggested calculation rather than hospitality. The kitchen was neat to the point of severity. every surface scrubbed, every utensil in its designated place. A small Christmas pudding sat on the counter, and beside it, incongruously, the dark blue collecting tin that Miss Hartwell had described. Miss Hartwell saw it at the same moment. "That is the tin! That is what the person carried this morning." Mrs. Bowen's hand moved toward it, then stopped. "That is one of our official collecting tins. We have several. It proves nothing." "It proves," Mr. Reeves said, setting his ledger on the table, "that you have access to the materials needed to impersonate a charity collector. Combined with the other irregularities, it forms a suggestive picture." Suggestive is not conclusive, but Mrs. Bowen's voice had lost some of its authority. Mr. Reeves, opened his ledger, turning to the page with his list of discrepancies. "Mrs. Bowen, I need you to explain several items. First, the matter of your own donation. You recorded £10 initially, then reduced it to £5, and an anonymous donation of £5 appeared shortly thereafter. Can you account for this?" "I overstated my initial contribution. When I realised I could not afford £10, I reduced it to £5 and made up the difference anonymously to avoid embarrassment. Surely there is nothing criminal in that. Except that the anonymous £5 appears to have come from money collected in Miss Hartwell's name, money that Miss Hartwell did not actually donate." Mrs. Bowen's face flushed. "That is absurd. I have no idea where that money came from." "Then perhaps," Mr. Reeves continued, his voice steady but strained, "you can explain the tinned goods added to the Pettigrew's donation. Expensive brands, wrapped in paper that smells of camphor. The same camphor I can smell in this house. Many people use camphor. It means nothing. It means nothing in isolation, but combined with the false entries, the anonymous donations, the collections taken twice." He paused, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the ledger. "Mrs. Bowen, I believe you have been taking from the charity collection for at least 2 years. I believe you took money you desperately needed, recorded false donations to hide the theft, and are now attempting to replace what you stole before anyone notices." The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Finch had sunk into a chair by the door, her face stricken. Miss Hartwell stood rigid, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Bowen with an expression of profound betrayal. Mrs. Bowen herself seemed to shrink, the sharp efficiency draining from her posture. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You do not understand. You cannot understand. After Harold died, there were debts, medical bills, funeral expenses. I had nothing. The charity collection was there in my keeping, and I thought I could borrow a small amount just until I could manage. I always intended to repay it." "But you did not repay it," Mr. Reeves said, not unkindly. "You took more. Because one debt led to another. The house needed repairs. The rates came due, and there was never enough. I thought if I could just manage through this year, if I could replace what I had taken gradually, no one would ever know." She looked up at him, her eyes desperate. "I have been trying, Colin. The tinned goods, the anonymous donations, I have been putting back what I took." "By stealing more," Miss Hartwell said coldly. "By collecting from me twice and pocketing the difference." "That was not me. I swear to you, I did not go door to door this morning." Mr. Reeves closed his ledger with a soft sound. "Mrs. Bowen, whether you collected from Miss Hartwell directly or simply benefited from confusion you created, the result is the same. Money intended for those in need has been diverted to your own use. This cannot continue. What will you do?" Mrs. Bowen's voice cracked. "Will you go to the police? Will you expose me to the entire lane?" "I do not wish to expose you, but I cannot allow the distribution to proceed with tainted funds. We must account for every penny, determine exactly how much was taken, and ensure it is repaid." "I cannot repay it all at once. I have nothing." "Then we will arrange terms, but it must be done properly, Mrs. Bowen. No more anonymous donations, no more creative accounting. Full transparency and repayment." Mrs. Bowen had begun to weep, silent tears that she made no effort to wipe away. Miss Marple, watching from her position by the door, felt a familiar sadness. She had seen this before, the proud person brought low by circumstance, the small theft that grew larger through desperation, the inevitable discovery that shattered a carefully maintained facade. "Colin," Mrs. Bowen said, her voice breaking, "please, give me until after Christmas. Let me have this one last day before everyone knows what I have done. I beg you, Mr." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "The distribution is scheduled for Boxing Day afternoon. I will say nothing until then, but on that day, Mrs. Bowen, you will confess what you have done and make arrangements for repayment. If you do not, I will be forced to take the matter to the proper authorities." He gathered his ledger and turned toward the door. Miss Hartwell followed him, her back rigid with disapproval. Mrs. Finch rose as well, casting a last troubled glance at Mrs. Bowen, who sat collapsed at her kitchen table, her face buried in her hands. Miss Marple was the last to leave. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back. "Mrs. Bowen," she said gently, "in my experience, confession is often less terrible than the fear of it. The truth, however painful, at least allows one to move forward." But Mrs. Bowen did not look up, and Miss Marple, with a small sigh, followed, the others out into the cold December night. Behind them, in the kitchen, where the confrontation had taken place, Mrs. Bowen remained alone, surrounded by the evidence of her respectable life and the wreckage of her reputation. It was the last time anyone would see her composed, for within hours Mr. Reeves would return to that kitchen, and what he would find there would transform a matter of petty theft into something far darker. Chapter 8. A Promise Deferred. Miss Marple did not sleep well that night. She had been given Mrs. Finch's spare bedroom again, the same room from which she had observed the unlatched door that afternoon. Now, as she lay in the darkness listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling, her mind turned over the events of the evening with the methodical attention she had learned to trust. Something was not quite right, or rather too many things were not quite right, and they did not align in the way one would expect. Mrs. Bowen's confession had been genuine enough. Miss Marple had seen enough false contrition to recognise the real article. The woman had stolen from the charity collection, had attempted to cover her theft through creative accounting and had been caught. That much was clear, but the pattern of the theft itself was odd. If Mrs. Bowen had truly needed money desperately, why had she taken such small amounts over such a long period? Why the elaborate system of false donations and anonymous contributions when a single, larger theft might have solved her immediate crisis? And why, having escaped detection for 2 years, had she suddenly begun replacing what she had taken this year, when doing so inevitably drew attention to the very irregularities she wished to hide? Miss Marple rose and went to the window, pulling her dressing gown more closely around her shoulders. The lane below was dark and silent, each house shut up for the night. Only in number 6, at the far end of the lane, did a light still burn. Mr. Reeves's house. She glanced at the small clock on the bedside table. 11:30, rather late for an elderly man living alone to be awake, particularly on Christmas Eve. Miss Marple made a decision. She dressed quickly, foregoing the niceties of proper attire in favour of practicality, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Finch's house was silent, her hostess long since retired. The back door was locked, but the key hung on its hook beside the frame, and Miss Marple let herself out into the garden. The night was cold but mercifully dry. She walked the familiar path to the utility room, then passed it toward the end of the lane where Mr. Reeves's house stood in its pool of lamplight. She was perhaps halfway there when she heard voices. They came from Mrs. Bowen's kitchen. The window was partially open despite the cold, and the voices carried in the still night air. Miss Marple paused, listening not from curiosity but from caution. If Mrs. Bowen and Mr. Reeves were meeting privately at this hour, the conversation was likely to be significant. She moved closer, keeping to the shadows of the garden wall. cannot simply let this matter rest, Clarice." That was Mr. Reeves, his voice weary but firm. "I gave you my word that I would say nothing until Boxing Day, and I will keep that promise. But the truth must come out." "Your promise?" Mrs. Bowen's voice was bitter. "You speak of promises, Colin, but what of the promise you made 3 years ago? What of your word then?" There was a pause. When Mr. Reeves spoke again, his tone had changed, become heavier with something that might have been regret. "That was different. The circumstances were different." "Were they? You promised Harold on his deathbed that you would look after me, that you would ensure I was not left destitute. How is exposing me to the entire lane consistent with that promise?" Miss Marple, listening in the darkness, felt pieces of the puzzle shift into new alignment. Harold Bowen had been Mrs. Bowen's late husband, the man who had handled the charity accounts before Mr. Reeves took over the task, and Mr. Reeves had promised him something, had promised to protect his widow. "I promised Harold that I would help you," Mr. Reeves said, his voice strained. "I did not promise to conceal theft. There is a difference, Clarice, and you know it." "Do I? Because from where I stand, Colin Reeves, your promise meant nothing the moment it became inconvenient for you. Harold trusted you. He thought you were his friend. He died believing you would ensure I was cared for. And I did try to help. When the debts first emerged, I offered to lend you money. You refused. You said you would manage on your own. Because I have my pride. Because I did not wish to be an object of charity, forever grateful to Colin Reeves for his generosity. So yes, I took from the collection small amounts that no one would miss, money that would have gone to strangers while I, Harold's widow, struggled to keep his house, to maintain the life he had wanted for me. That does not justify theft. Does it not?" Mrs. Bowen's voice had risen. "You speak of justification, but you know nothing of necessity. You have your pension, your comfortable house, your reputation as the reliable man everyone trusts. I had nothing but debts and a name I was expected to uphold. Harold was respected in this lane, Colin. Everyone knew him as generous, capable, honest. How could I admit that he had left me with nothing but bills? How could I confess that the man everyone admired had been terrible with money?" There was a sound of a chair scraping, and when Mr. Reeves spoke again, he was clearly standing. "So, you stole to protect Harold's reputation, and your own." "I borrowed. I always intended to repay it. But you did not repay it. You took more. And then, this year, when I began to notice the irregularities, you panicked and tried to replace what you'd stolen. The anonymous donations, the tinned goods in the Pettigrew's box, all of it in an attempt to cover your tracks before I could expose you. What choice did I have? You made it clear you intended to examine the accounts thoroughly this year. You said the numbers did not align, that you would need to understand where every penny had gone. I knew that if you looked closely enough, you would discover what I had done. So yes, I tried to replace the money. I sold what I could, scraped together every shilling, and put it back into the collection. But it was not enough. The account still did not balance. Because I could not replace it all. Do you understand, Colin? I tried. I genuinely tried to make this right before you discovered it. But there was not enough time, not enough money. Her voice broke. And now you will destroy me anyway. Miss Marple heard footsteps, the sound of movement in the kitchen. When Mr. Reeves spoke again, his voice was closer to the window. I do not wish to destroy you, Clarice. I wish only to set things right. The people who donated to this collection did so in good faith. Those who will receive the distributions are in genuine need. The money must go where it was intended. And my needs? Are they not genuine? Your needs are real, but they do not justify stealing from the poor to maintain appearances. There was a long silence. Then Mrs. Bowen said, very quietly, You will not reconsider. You will not give me more time to replace what I took. How much more time? Another year? 2 years? It has already been too long, Clarice. This matter must be resolved. Then you leave me no choice. Something in her tone made Miss Marple move closer to the window. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see into the kitchen. Mrs. Bowen stood near the table, her back to the window. Mr. Reeves faced her, his expression troubled but resolute. Between them, on the table, sat his ledger, and beside it, the dark blue collecting tin. "What do you mean?" Mr. Reeves asked, and there was a note of wariness in his voice now. "I mean," Mrs. Bowen said, "that if you insist on exposing me, I shall have to tell the truth about Harold. All of it, including what you know, but have never spoken of." Mr. Reeves went very still. "You would not." "Would I not? You think I will simply accept ruin while you maintain your position as the Honourable Mr. Reeves, keeper of accounts and guardian of propriety? If I fall, Colin, you will fall with me. I have done nothing wrong, have you not? You knew 3 years ago that Harold had been taking from the collection. You discovered it when you took over the accounts. Small amounts, just as I have done to cover the debts he was ashamed to admit. And you said nothing. You kept his secret even after he died. You promised him you would protect me, but you also promised him you would protect his reputation. You have been covering for him, for us, all this time." Miss Marple, listening in the darkness, understood now. The pattern had not begun with Mrs. Bowen at all. It had begun with her late husband, and Mr. Reeves had discovered it and said nothing, had kept the secret out of loyalty to a dying friend, had taken on the accounting duties himself to ensure no one else would discover what Harold Bowen had done. And Mrs. Bowen, discovering her husband's theft after his death, had simply continued it, knowing that Mr. Reeves's own matters implicated him, that he could not expose her without exposing Harold's crime and his own complicity in concealing it. That was different, Mr. Reeves said, but his voice lacked conviction. Harold was dying, he was desperate, and the amounts he took were small, already repaid by the time I discovered them. Were they? Are you certain of that, Colin? Or did you simply choose to believe they had been repaid because it was easier than investigating further? Mrs. Bowen moved closer to him, her voice urgent now. If you examine the accounts from Harold's final years carefully, and I mean truly carefully, you will find irregularities you overlooked. Irregularities that suggest the total taken was considerably more than you believed. And if you force me to confess, I will ensure that everyone knows you discovered Harold's theft and said nothing, that you have been protecting a dead man's reputation while condemning his widow for doing exactly what he did. Mr. Reeves had aged visibly in the last few minutes. He reached for the edge of the table as though needing its support. You're asking me to continue concealing theft, to allow the distribution to proceed with tainted funds. I am asking you to honour your promise to Harold, to give me time, real time, and to make this right properly. I will repay every penny, Colin, I swear it. But I need more than 2 days. I need months, perhaps a year. Let me sell the house if I must, downsize to something smaller. Let me preserve what little dignity I have left. And the distribution on Boxing Day will proceed as planned. No one will know the money's origin. The people in need will receive their help, and I will quietly, over time, replace what was taken. Is that not a better outcome than public scandal for the both of us? Mr. Reeves stood in silence, his hands gripping the table edge. Miss Marple could see the struggle in his posture, the weight of competing obligations pressing down upon him. He said, I gave Harold my word, and I have tried to honour it. But this cannot continue, Clarice. I will give you until Easter, 4 months to begin making restitution. But if by Easter you have not demonstrated genuine progress, I will have no choice but to bring this matter to light. Harold's reputation and mine will simply have to weather the consequences. Easter, Mrs. Bowen repeated. 4 months. 4 months, and in that time there will be no more irregularities, no more false donations, no more creative accounting. You will make no further withdrawals from any charitable collection, and you will begin repaying what you took through legitimate means. And if I cannot, then we will both face what must be faced." Mrs. Bowen nodded slowly, and Miss Marple saw her shoulders sag with something that might have been relief or merely exhaustion. "Thank you, Colin, you are more generous than I deserve." "I am not generous," he replied. "I am simply trying to keep a promise to a dead friend. God help me, I'm not even certain it is the right thing to—" "Oh," and he gathered his ledger and moved toward the door. Mrs. Bowen remained at the table, her hand resting on the collecting tin as though it were some kind of talisman. "Colin," she called as he reached the threshold, "I truly am sorry for what that is worth." "So am I," he said quietly. "So am I." Miss Marple withdrew into the shadows as Mr. Reeves emerged from the house and made his way slowly toward his own residence at the end of the lane. She waited until his door had closed behind him, before moving quietly back toward Mrs. Finch's house. But as she walked, she found herself troubled by what she had heard. Mr. Reeves had agreed to delay the confrontation, to give Mrs. Bowen time. It was a decision born of compassion and old loyalty, and Miss Marple could not fault his motives. But she had seen such delays before, had seen how time, which was meant to allow for repentance and restitution, instead allowed for desperation to deepen. And desperate people, she had learned, often made choices they would never have contemplated in calmer moments. She could only hope that this would not be one of those times. Chapter 9. An Unwelcome Discovery. Miss Marple woke on Christmas morning to the sound of someone knocking urgently at Mrs. Finch's door. She rose quickly, pulling on her dressing gown, and had reached the landing when she heard Mrs. Finch answer the summons. A man's voice, agitated and breathless, filled the hallway below. "Mrs. Finch, you must come. It is Colin Reeves. I went to his house to wish him Christmas greetings, and I found—" The voice broke off. "Please, you must come at once." Miss Marple descended the stairs to find Mrs. Finch standing in her nightdress and wrapper, her face pale, speaking with a portly gentleman of perhaps 70, whom Miss Marple had not previously encountered. "Mr. Pettigrew," Mrs. Finch was saying, "please calm yourself. What has happened to Mr. Reeves?" "He is dead, Mrs. Finch. Collapsed in Mrs. Bowen's kitchen. I found him there not 10 minutes ago when I went looking for him." The words seemed to echo in the small hallway. Mrs. Finch swayed slightly, and Miss Marple moved forward to steady her. "Are you certain he is dead?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mr. Pettigrew turned to her, seeming to notice her presence for the first time. "Quite certain, madam. I have seen death before. There is no mistaking it." "We must telephone for the doctor," Mrs. Finch said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And the police. Oh, heavens! Poor Colin!" Within the hour, Foxglove End had been transformed from a quiet lane preparing for Christmas celebration into a scene of official inquiry. The doctor arrived first, a brisk young man who confirmed what Mr. Pettigrew had already stated. Mr. Reeves was indeed dead, had been for several hours. The police followed shortly after, in the person of Inspector Wilkins from the village station, a competent-looking man in his 40s who listened carefully to Mr. Pettigrew's account of the discovery. Miss Marple, having dressed properly and been introduced as Mrs. Finch's visiting friend, was present when the inspector questioned the residents who had gathered in Mrs. Finch's sitting room. Mrs. Bowen was notably absent. "Now then," Inspector Wilkins said, consulting his notebook, "Mr. Pettigrew, you say you found the deceased in Mrs. Bowen's kitchen at approximately 8 o'clock this morning." "That is correct. My wife and I returned late last evening from our daughter's house. We had intended to stay through Christmas, but Helen was unwell and wished to sleep in her own bed. I woke early, as is my habit, and noticed a light still burning in Mr. Reeves's house. I went to investigate, found his door unlocked, and when I called out with no response, I searched the lane. I found him in Mrs. Bowen's kitchen, collapsed beside the table. And Mrs. Bowen was not present. The house appeared empty." Inspector Wilkins made a note. "Did you observe anything unusual in the kitchen? Anything that might suggest how Mr. Reeves came to be there?" Mr. Pettigrew hesitated. "There was a ledger on the table and what appeared to be a collecting tin, but I did not examine anything closely. I simply confirmed that Colin was beyond help and came to fetch assistance. Miss Hartwell, who sat rigid in her chair by the window, spoke suddenly. "Inspector, there were irregularities in the charity collection accounts. Mr. Reeves discovered them and confronted Mrs. Bowen about them yesterday evening. We were all present for part of that conversation." The inspector's attention sharpened. "What sort of irregularities?" Miss Hartwell explained, her voice tight with controlled emotion, about the false donations, the collections taken twice, the anonymous contributions that masked theft. As she spoke, Inspector Wilkins's expression grew increasingly grave. "And Mr. Reeves confronted Mrs. Bowen with these accusations?" "He did, in her kitchen at approximately 6 o'clock yesterday evening. He told her that the matter must be resolved, that the truth must come out." How did Mrs. Bowen respond? She confessed, admitted she had taken money from the collection over a period of years. She begged for more time, asked Mr. Reeves to delay any public disclosure until after Christmas. And did Mr. Reeves agree to this delay? There was a pause. Miss Hartwell looked uncomfortable. "He said he would say nothing until Boxing Day, when the distribution was scheduled, but he insisted that Mrs. Bowen must confess and make arrangements for repayment." Inspector Wilkins closed his notebook. "I see. And where is Mrs. Bowen now?" No one could answer. Mrs. Bowen's house stood silent, its curtains drawn, no smoke rising from its chimney despite the cold Christmas morning. The inspector rose. "I shall need to examine the scene more thoroughly. In the meantime, I must ask you all to remain available for further questioning. And if Mrs. Bowen returns, she is to be informed that I require her immediate attendance." After he departed, the small group sat in troubled silence. Finally, Mrs. Finch said, "Do you think, could Clarice have done something to Colin, in desperation?" "The doctor said he appeared to have died of natural causes," Mr. Pettigrew replied. "A collapse of some sort. There were no marks of violence." Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly throughout these exchanges, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Pettigrew, you mentioned that Mr. Reeves was found beside the table. Was he sitting or lying on the floor?" "Lying on the floor. Collapsed as though he had fallen from his chair." "And the ledger you mentioned, was it open or closed?" "Open, I believe, though, as I said, I did not examine it closely." "Of course not." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the lane. "Mrs. Finch, do you know if Mr. Reeves had any history of heart trouble or similar ailments?" "Not that I'm aware. He always seemed quite healthy for his age. And yet he collapsed and died in Mrs. Bowen's kitchen in the early hours of Christmas morning, having confronted her the previous evening with evidence of theft." Miss Marple turned back to the room. One must ask what brought him back to that kitchen. What was so urgent that it could not wait until morning? Miss Hartwell leaned forward. "You think Mrs. Bowen summoned him?" "I think it possible. A message sent late in the evening, perhaps, asking him to return. A plea for one final conversation before Christmas Day arrived." "But why would he go? He had already given her his terms." Miss Marple thought of what she had overheard the previous night, the conversation about Harold Bowen's theft, about Mr. Reeves's promise, about the extension till Easter that he had granted. But she had not been meant to hear that conversation, and she was not certain how much of it she should reveal. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "there were matters between them that required further discussion, matters that Mr. Reeves felt obligated to address." Mrs. Finch had begun to weep quietly. "Poor Colin. To die alone on Christmas Eve in someone else's kitchen, it is too dreadful." But Miss Marple was thinking of something else. She was thinking of Mrs. Bowen's desperation, of her plea for time, of her threat to expose Mr. Reeves's complicity in concealing her late husband's theft. She was thinking of the heavy box, the unlatched door, the careful corrections to the donor list. And she was thinking of the one piece of information that did not fit. If Mr. Reeves had died of natural causes, as the doctor suggested, why had Mrs. Bowen fled? The answer, she suspected, lay in what had truly happened in that kitchen during the hours between her observation of their conversation and Mr. Pettigrew's discovery of the body, and that answer depended upon understanding not just what Mrs. Bowen had done, but what she had failed to do. From outside came the sound of the inspector's motor car starting, followed by voices as he gave instructions to the constable who had accompanied him. The investigation was beginning in earnest now, and soon the truth would emerge. But Miss Marple, gazing out at the quiet lane with its Christmas decorations and shuttered windows, already understood what that truth would reveal. Not murder in the conventional sense, perhaps, but something that in its own way was equally damning: the failure to act, the choice to preserve oneself at the cost of another's life. In St. Mary Mead, she had once known a woman who had watched her husband collapse from a heart attack and had waited 15 minutes before calling for help, hoping he would die and free her from an unhappy marriage. The husband had survived, and the marriage had continued, but the woman's guilt had eventually destroyed her more thoroughly than any divorce could have done. Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Bowen, wherever she had fled, would find no escape from a similar burden. For there were some choices, once made, that could never be unmade. Chapter 10. How the Lane Chose Not to See. Mrs. Bowen was found late on Christmas afternoon sitting in the utility room with her coat buttoned to the chin and her hands folded in her lap, waiting. She had not fled at all, Inspector Wilkins discovered. She had simply been sitting there since before dawn, in the cold room with its extinguished paraffin heater, surrounded by the boxes of donations and the notice board with its revealing lists. When the constable opened the door, she looked up without surprise. "I thought you would come eventually," she said. "I have been waiting to tell you what happened." They brought her to Mrs. Finch's sitting room, where Miss Marple and the others had gathered. Inspector Wilkins sat across from her, his notebook open, his expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Bowen," he began, "I must caution you that anything you say may be taken down and used in evidence. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly." Her voice was steady, drained of emotion. "I wish to make a statement about Mr. Reeves's death." "Very well. Please proceed." Mrs. Bowen drew a breath, her hands tightening in her lap. "Last evening, after Mr. Reeves left my house, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about our conversation, about the deadline he had given me. Boxing Day seemed impossibly soon, so I sent him a note, asking him to return to my kitchen this morning before dawn. I told him I needed to discuss the matter further, that I had thought of a solution. And did he come? He did. At approximately 5 o'clock this morning, he brought his ledger, intending, I think, to show me precisely what needed to be repaid. We sat at the kitchen table and she paused, her voice wavering. I pleaded with him one final time, asked him to give me more time than he had offered yesterday evening. Months, perhaps a year. I promised I would repay everything, that I would sell the house if necessary. What was his response? He was kind, kinder than I deserved. He said he had already decided to extend the deadline until Easter, that he would not expose me before then, provided I made no further withdrawals and began demonstrating genuine progress toward restitution. Mrs. Bowen's eyes filled with tears. He was trying to help me, you see, trying to honour his promise to my late husband while also doing what was right. Miss Marple, listening quietly from her chair by the fire, noted the precise details of Mrs. Bowen's account. The woman was not lying, or at least not about this part of the story. "And then what occurred?" Inspector Wilkins asked. "We were discussing how I might begin the repayment, what I could sell, how I could economise, when Colin suddenly stopped speaking. His face had gone very pale, and his hand went to his chest. He said something about feeling unwell, about a tightness, and then," her voice broke, "then he collapsed, simply fell from his chair onto the floor." "What did you do?" The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Bowen stared at her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. Nothing. I did nothing. You did not attempt to help him? To summon a doctor? I did not. I sat there frozen, and I watched him struggle to breathe. He reached toward me, his eyes asking for help, and I simply sat there, because I realized, you see, that if he died, all my problems would die with him. There would be no confrontation, no confession, no public shame. The irregularities he had discovered would remain his private knowledge, and I could simply continue to replace what I had taken quietly, over time, with no one the wiser. Miss Hartwell had gone white. Mrs. Finch pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Mr. Pettigrew looked away, his expression one of profound distress. "How long did you wait before summoning help?" the inspector asked, his voice carefully controlled. I did not summon help. I sat there for perhaps 5 minutes, watching Colin's struggles grow weaker, and then he was still, and I understood that I had made a choice, that by doing nothing I had killed him as surely as if I had struck him down myself. "Mrs. Bowen, please let me finish." She looked up now, meeting the inspector's gaze directly. After he died, I panicked. I could not think clearly. I left the house through the back door and went to the utility room, intending to— I do not know what I intended. To hide, perhaps. To think, to decide what to do. I have been sitting there since dawn, trying to understand what I have become, trying to find some way to justify what I did. But there is no justification, is there? I let a good man die because it was convenient for me, because saving him would have meant exposing myself. Inspector Wilkins closed his notebook slowly. "Mrs. Bowen? The doctor has examined Mr. Reeves and determined that he died of a heart attack. He believes the death would have occurred regardless of medical intervention, given the severity of the attack and the time it would have taken to summon help. That may be true, but I did not know that when I sat there watching him die. I made the choice to do nothing, and that choice was made from pure self-interest. Whether he might have lived or not is immaterial to my guilt." The inspector looked troubled. "The law distinguishes between action and inaction, Mrs. Bowen. You did not cause Mr. Reeves's heart attack. You simply failed to render aid." "Failed to render aid," she repeated bitterly. "What a gentle phrase for watching someone die so that you might preserve your reputation." Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. "Inspector Wilkins, might I ask Mrs. Bowen a question?" He looked surprised but nodded. "If Mrs. Bowen consents." "I consent," Mrs. Bowen said. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Bowen, you have confessed to theft and to failing to help Mr. Reeves when he collapsed. But I wonder if you might tell us about something else. Last night, after Mr. Reeves left your house the first time, what made you decide to ask him to return this morning?" Mrs. Bowen looked confused by the question. "I told you. I wanted more time. I thought perhaps if we spoke again privately I could persuade him, but he had already given you more time, had he not? He had already extended your deadline from Boxing Day to Easter. I believe that conversation occurred after the one we witnessed, in which he told you he would wait until Boxing Day. Am I correct?" There was a sharp intake of breath. Mrs. Bowen's face had gone very pale. "How did you were not there. That conversation was private." "I was walking in the garden," Miss Marple said gently. "Your kitchen window was open. I did not intend to eavesdrop, but I could not help overhearing. Mr. Reeves agreed to give you until Easter, provided you began making genuine restitution. He was quite clear about this. So why, having received this concession, did you ask him to return before dawn? What more could you possibly have needed to discuss?" Mrs. Bowen's composure finally cracked. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. When she could speak again, her words came haltingly. "'Cause Easter was not enough. Because even 4 months seemed impossible. I had nothing to sell that would raise sufficient funds quickly. The house is mortgaged, my jewellery is paste, and I have no savings. I realised, sitting alone in my kitchen, that no amount of time would be enough, that I could never repay what I had taken without admitting why I needed to. So I thought perhaps if I spoke with him one more time, I could convince him to simply let the matter